Hello and welcome to the third part of our SD webinar series. Just a reminder that everyone's microphones have been muted and videos are turned off. Please use the Q&A function if you have any questions. We will try to answer as many questions as we can live. However, you may receive a follow-up email if your question is not answered today. Following the webinar, participants will receive a PDF of the presentation and a link to the recording. And I do apologize if you attended the first two. We are having some technical difficulties, but I will be getting those PDFs sent out to you this week. There are no CEUs for this webinar series, and you can find recordings for this and our other webinar series at our website. Thank you again, and I will turn it over to Laura and Marie.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us again to talk about setting up arrangements that support self-determination. I'm Laura Demuse. This is the third webinar in a series of 4. And so if you did miss the other 2 before this, which were on good person-centered planning and how that supports self-directed services and building a budget, they, like Heather said, they will be recorded for future perusal. So let's get into setting up an arrangement. And then on Thursday, if you can join us at 3, we will also be doing a webinar on arrangement oversight and responsibility. And that will wrap up this long journey that we've been on. So today we're going to really talk about, we're level setting that we're all at the point of where the person has already decided what they're going to self-direct. Their budget is done and ready to be implemented. They understand what authority and control they have. And this whole thing is going to guide you through the setup of the arrangement. Usually when the person doesn't already have staff in mind, and how to kind of get them rolling and hired. So as we go through this, again, we talked in the beginning about how these arrangements are alternative models of service delivery. It's not a program or a service. It's just a way of getting services in a unique way. So when you do a direct hire arrangement, the employees are the employees of that beneficiary. They're not CMH contracted employees. So a lot of the rules and regulations that you have for contracted employees of the CMH do not apply to these arrangements. And so that's really the big difference between a traditional model and this model of service delivery. The budget and the employees themselves are also not CMH managed. So once the budget is agreed upon by the CMH and the individual, really anything that goes on within the budget is supposed to follow whatever was planned. And so the FMS, or the fiscal intermediary, FMS is now financial management service for those of you who don't know. That is just a term that we changed. It's similar to what CMS calls the fiscal intermediary. It's just a little more plain language and people kind of understand what it means better. So if you hear me say FMS, that's what I'm talking about, formerly known as fiscal intermediary, FI. The people, once their plan is done, their budget starts, that budget gives them control over the dollars that are in that budget. And that gives them control over amount, scope, duration, location, and the providers that are inside of their arrangement. So you will see flexibility in a budget where people are able to move things around and maybe use more service one week and less another week, to be able to kind of flex things as needed, as that is part of budget authority. And then the last thing that's really important to understand is that the risk mitigation that needs to happen with the CMH is happening through the planning process, is happening through prevention, through our agreements that we're going to go through today, and through the budget. So anything that's happening that needs to be discussed where there's maybe a red flag or an issue that someone has some worry over, it really should be discussed earlier and defined before things become trouble, I guess. Uh, so those things are, you want to keep those in mind as we go through this, and kind of keep your alternative service delivery model in mind as we talk about this.
I just want to add that we are talking not only about employees in the direct hire, uh, excuse me, arrangements, but also when we're talking about this, we're talking about the provider purchase of service options, especially specific to not being a contracted panel provider when it comes to those contract requirements that a community mental health may have for their contracted providers. Just because it's a professional provider does not mean that those same requirements would apply in these arrangements.
So as we said, by now, the type of arrangement should have been defined. So the three models that, like Marie was just saying, you have your direct hire arrangements, your purchase of service arrangements, which is typically a professional who's not contract or impaneled with the CMH, that for whatever reason this individual is interested in doing a direct contract with, so that that individual can work with them. And what we call agency with choice or agency supported self-direction. And that is just usually an agency, typically has maybe direct care workers or maybe respite workers. And they have agreed to allow that person to have a lot more control over kind of who's coming into their house, and providing that basic management while that person is in the house. So the agency is technically, the employer, but there's like a co-employment thing going on where the person themselves is able to have responsibility over the management of that individual while they're working for them. So they can kind of hire them into their house, fire them out of their house. Obviously, they would still work for that agency. So this choice of whoever the FMS should have already happened through that person-centered planning process. And then which services will be purchased. And I think that's something that's really really has to be understood in these arrangements, is that you're really using dollars to purchase things at this point. It's not the same as the CMH providing a menu of services and then people choosing those services, but really using dollars in a creative way to be able to purchase the things that will help people meet their goals, which is kind of the next one. So, and then that should be outlined. Whatever those things are that had been determined during that planning process should be outlined in the budget as how they're going to use those things, like when and where and why, so that everybody's kind of on the same page and the plan for spending those dollars is known to everybody. Again, we're looking at preventing any risks from happening. So using the SD agreement, anytime that there's concern, I don't know, Marie, do you have a good example off the top of your head? Just thinking about maybe there's a concern about people going over their budget for whatever reason, or not being well versed in how to schedule people. So there's a worry that too many hours will be used up too quickly. So being able to put a strategy in there about, typically just having an agreement that this person will regularly meet with their team to kind of go over how the arrangement is going, where we are, in that the use of that budget, etc., are things that can kind of prevent anything from getting out of hand. And that's really just best practice in general to make sure that people are staying on track. The other part is information and assistance. So making sure that people really understand what their roles and responsibilities are, really understanding how these arrangements work, like all of the things that go into that, which we'll get into in a little while. But they're really taking on a new role. So they're in these direct hire arrangements, they are going to be the employer of record. And many people have never done that before. So really understand what they're getting into, and being able to build on any skills that they need to be the best employer that they can be. So the plan is done, the budget's made, this person is ready to start and rock and roll and get people hired on their on their team to be able to start getting these services going. So the first thing that needs to happen is they're going to kind of sign up, for lack of better words, to be an employer. So they're going to send employer paperwork to the FMS. That's going to include their employer identification number application. That's, so they can have taxes and things associated with their name, so that all of those fund IRS and government documents can be completed. The FMS agreement, which is one of the agreements between the person and the FMS that's done through the CMH, is completed to make sure that everybody's on the same page about who's going to do what when. Then there's a power of attorney. So no matter who the beneficiary is in these arrangements, even if it's a child, this is set up so that the FMS has the ability to be able to do taxes on behalf of the individual and kind of take over that role. So they sign over this power of attorney for these tax purposes, and then consent for workman's comp, which will be available to all of the direct hire employees that the person chooses to hire. And the FMS kind of takes care of a lot of that responsibility so that the employer of record doesn't have to worry about any of that. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be doing a bunch of payroll, taxes, etc.
And I would only add that when it comes to filling out and completing those initial pieces of paperwork, your FMS should have experience and expertise in what each one of those are. Many of them have a document that outlines and explains each form that has to be completed, so that everyone is, again, fully aware of what they're completing, what they're signing, especially when it comes to that power of attorney. That can make some people go, wait, what am I signing? So making sure that people fully understand what each of those documents give the FMS power for and over is really important.
Absolutely. So as the arrangement starts and people start to get hired, the employer record, so as we know, all aid-level staff and all staff that are going to support the person need to be trained on the plan of service. So in these arrangements, because they are the employer, and even though it's their own plan and it kind of seems silly, they should be trained in their plan so that they then can reciprocate, I guess, and then train their own employees on their plan of service. So just like in an agency or group home, for example, somebody there, the supervisor, needs to be trained in the person's plan of service so that they can go ahead and train their staff. It's the same thing for this employer of record being trained on the IPS, and then they can train their own staff. So you want to give them that ability to be able to be ready for when their workers come in, to be able to train on that plan of service. And really, as this begins, the CMH is switching from kind of getting everything ready and maybe having more of a I guess their fingers and everything, because they really are working on setting this up and making sure that it succeeds, and they're switching over to a more supportive role, so more oversight and just making sure that things are going well, and not so much control at this point. And then if there's any need for anything that the employer record needs help with, or maybe we're worried that there's a gap in a skill or understanding, support broker can really help with almost any other support that's needed. So if that's something the person would benefit from, you'd want to make sure that a broker is getting hired at least in sync with, if not before, the other workers get hired. So our budget is already made, but what did we put in it? Obviously wages have been approved, but other benefits, mileage, training, paid time off, overtime, retention bonuses, perhaps a salary, healthcare, maybe cell phone reimbursement. What is in there that the person is going to be able to offer their employees. They need to know this so that when they're trying to recruit people, they have things to be able to offer, maybe that another employer would not be able to, and be able to attract good employees. The other thing that we want to make sure, if it hasn't happened already, that this employer record is really getting trained on the Fair Labor Standards Act. So really the basics of being an employer. So if you're going to go out and interview people, you need to know, for example, what is discriminatory language, or that the person is going to have to pay people when they worked a shift that was scheduled, and that when the person came to work, that's going to come out of their budget. There's no kind of do-overs or take-backs, or like, oh, I didn't mean to have you work that shift, so I'm not going to pay you. Like, that is a basic labor law. The other part is, really that employer record is taking on these responsibilities as the employer, and the CMH is just the payer. So that's why the CMH is kind of taking a back seat at this point, because otherwise it's considered a joint employment arrangement, and there can be some consequences of that. So again, these are employees of this person, and they need to understand the laws around that. So the CMH, for example, if they're getting into telling the employer how much to pay their workers, then that's kind of a factor that a court would look at if it went that far, as to if this was a joint employment arrangement. If they're telling people who they can hire and fire, if they're telling them what training that they have to have beyond our state qualifications, if they're trying to control any aspect of worker performance, if they're doing any scheduling, or somehow managing that employer, then their employee, excuse me, then again, there's a risk that they be perceived as a joint employer.
And I think it's important to point out that when we talk about this, we don't mean that the CMH just goes hands off, right? You're still needing to provide a supportive role. And we get that feedback a lot, like, well, we're scared about joint co-employment, and so we're just not going to touch these areas. And that's really not the case. And it's not even all that nuance. It's really just, you're not controlling it. The employer is leading these discussions, leading the effort. But if they need support in things like training or how to approach a topic, especially when it comes to like overseeing employees, hiring, firing, things like that, that you're there to provide that supportive role, but you're not the one taking charge.
Yeah. I think it's just like anything else. You just want to provide informed consent, make sure that people understand what their options are, but not telling them what they need to do in those situations. So, for example, if people are trying to hire people and they're not able to find somebody on their own, it doesn't mean that the CMH just throws up in their hands and says, oh, well, you can't find anybody, I guess you're not going to have any services for a while. That's unacceptable. But that they can kind of help, maybe these are places you should look for, or should post ads, or these are places you could look for people to give some suggestions. Suggestions are not control, right? The person still has the ability to take your advice or not take your advice. So that's kind of an example of how to support without, necessarily controlling the situation. So the person, once they're getting ready to hire somebody, they need to prepare for interviewing. So they should really understand, based on their needs, when they want people in their house. So how long of a shift the person will work for, and how many hours, and kind of what generally that person is going to do during that shift. Be able to formulate some interview questions, which we'll get into later, and really help them, define what this job is as an individualized job. So this job is kind of unique because you're not, going to a store and selling widgets or trying to get people to buy hamburgers or whatever. You're really just trying to support this individual. So the person is almost selling themselves, right? They're trying to really market like you would benefit I would be able to benefit from you working for me, and you would be able to benefit from supporting me by X, right? So kind of knowing what all of that is before you get into the interviews is pretty important. So there'll be two different things: a job post or a job ad and a job description are talked about a lot in these arrangements. And if you don't kind of know the difference between the two, they could kind of sound like the same thing. And they are similar, but they are different. So, really a job post or a job ad is really supposed to be selling the job. It's meant to catch a person's eye, kind of have a wow factor if possible, something that pulls pulls the person in. So, like I think that's how we got so many different terms for a direct care worker. We have direct support professionals and personal assistants and personal caregivers and all of the different titles that we have. So if if the employer wants to get really creative and make them the executive care associate or whatever it is that they think might attract work, that's fine. I mean, inside the CMH, it'll probably still say CLS, but whatever that job is to them, that's okay. So the job ad should summarize kind of the most interesting points of the job and generally what it is, and then really kind of describe like the atmosphere of the home, what the role is, where it is, and then any perks that might draw somebody to that job. And then the job description is really just more describing the actual position. If you think about your own jobs and what you have as a list in your HR department, it's a little more straightforward and to the point. It's just kind of accurately describing what the position is and the responsibilities. And then really a good job description will kind of describe what the success in that role will look like and things that the person must have to meet the responsibilities and qualifications of the job. So I found this and I thought it was interesting. Just a survey of, the top 10 places where people go to recruit and successfully recruit people for direct care work. So as you can see, Indeed, and I guess that's free or the paid plan. I thought it was interesting that most of it is beyond that is current employees or word of mouth. So, if you're just starting, obviously that's a little bit harder to get started. But people get word of mouth out even through social media, etc. And then you have the various other sites. So people maybe networking with their friends and family to see if they can find somebody that knows somebody, and recruiting wherever they can, depending on what's in their area is always a good idea. So when you put that post out, you can be very vague in general, right? You say, we're hiring any caregiver out there, which will get you a lot of people that apply, but not necessarily people that you want to hire, right? Because you're just casting a really wide net of pretty much everybody out there who's over 18 and can pass a background check per se. And then the second thing in this infographic really talks about being very specific. So you're hiring, in this case, it says a home health aide, but a caregiver for the second shift, full time. And then this is in Scranton, but this would be wherever you are in Michigan, right? So second shift full time in the city I happen to live in, and I want second shift and I want a full-time job, that's going to be more specific and get people that it's going to whittle down the people that apply, but you're going to get more people that actually want the job that you're posting. So other places that a person can advertise are on community job boards. We already said social media, and then we get into the online world. Indeed was already on there. A lot of people use care.com. Michigan Works, typically if the employer tells Michigan Works that they are working through a nonprofit, which most of the CMHs are not, for all of CMHs are nonprofit, they can post for free typically. And Handshake is another good place that colleges use for college jobs. And actually very recently they just started accepting people that need these direct care workers on their website. So those are all good places that a person can try. And I guess you can kind of see that. So I just made off of a template, like a sample job posting. So you can see that this is for a direct care worker. You have a kind of splashy title that hopefully would draw people in. This one says the person will work in a fun environment with paid time off and flexible scheduling, and gives a little bit of information about who the person is, and I guess the bigger picture of what the person's going to do there, the employee is going to do there. So, in this scenario, the person that's hiring has a dream of going to college. She enjoys theater. She would prefer to have somebody who can help her navigate college life, drive, and work with her compassionately in times of distress. It has the pay range posted. Nowadays, employees like to see ahead of time what the pay range is so that they kind of know right away if it's something that they're willing to accept or not. So don't be afraid to put that pay range in there. The FMS again should have worked with the individual by now to be able to tell them what the range that they can offer is, so that employer records should know. Something that they want to keep in mind when they put this pay range out is to really think about when they're hiring a new hire versus someone who's been there for a long time. So if the range is actually higher than this per se, maybe their new hire range is actually less than this, or what this says, but they actually could pay more. So there's an opportunity for raises or adjustments in the future, because obviously the more you're paying people, the more your budget you're using. And if you invest that money in somebody who doesn't stay around, then you have less of that budget to use for later use. So it's always wise to try to hire somebody in, give them kind of a probationary time, make sure that they're going to stay around, and then kind of kick up their pay. So again, just kind of tips for that employer record to be able to keep and recruit and retain their workers for longer periods of time. And so then we get into our requirements, which hopefully you'll all be familiar with, because they kind of reflect our staff qualifications for Medicaid. And in her particular needs, she puts some physical things that the person needs to be able to perform. And then, kind of goes into some of the things that the person will have responsibilities for, where the job is at, and why that's a good place to work. Think that specific part is probably more for if you're trying to attract people maybe from outside the area to come to your area. So like that actually might be reversed. Like maybe you wanted to hire somebody out in Leslie, which is outside of Lansing, but there's maybe not as much to do there. So you might want to say like why Leslie is a great place to work and the things that are great there. But this particular one talks about why Lansing is a great place to work. And then just specifically why whoever's reading this should apply. And in this case, you get to kind of sell again the person and who they are and why a person would want to work with them. So we threw in the paid time off, raises, and flexible scheduling from the top again. Talked about training and working with great people. So this is just an example, and I found this a template online and filled this out. So if anybody ever needs something to start off of, there's a wealth of resources out there for people to be able to make some of these things. And then we get into the actual job description. Again, it's just an example because it was a young woman in the job post. I named her Sarah Jones for fun, I guess. And we really talk about, because this is a self-directed arrangement, that the person will be working under her direct supervision, what her responsibilities are, and the famous all of these duties and other duties as assigned. So it's always a good thing to put things like that in your job description, just in case something is missed that ends up being important. This is a very, very general job description, and you should make things as individualized to the person as possible. But again, this is just an example. So you'll see one of the first responsibilities is to display a strong work ethic, maintain honest timesheet calculation, adhere to training requirements, and show up for shifts on time as scheduled. And then kind of goes through all of the good stuff about making sure to report any recipient rights, incidences, maintain confidentiality, participate in any investigation that might happen, providing assistance to Sarah, in this case, being able to document all services provided in the home, prepare nutritious meals, in this case, I guess, meals that reflect Sarah's preferences, and grocery items that using grocery items she purchased, assisting her with ADLs, laundry, activities, hobbies, physical therapy, socialization, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the overall gist of kind of, these are outlining the roles and responsibilities of that employee in this job. And then, just because it wouldn't fit on one page, we get back into the eligibility requirements for being a direct care provider, the skills and abilities needed, and like you'd see in any job description. So making sure that whatever is in here meets the needs of the person is really important. And again, it's a template that I found online, so you can kind of help people find similar descriptions and job ads to be able to support them in an individual way, to specifically to what they need.
And we also do have a sample job description. I believe it's at the back with all the other sample forms and the technical guidance. And one thing that I would always encourage people is, when you want those specific job responsibilities to be as individualized as possible, right? So you're making sure, and we'll talk about this when it comes to the next webinar, when it comes to overview, but you're tying that into the goals of the plan and the interventions of the plan as detailed as possible, so that that staff really knows exactly what type of support that person needs to grocery shop independently, whatever that task is, then to help them meet whatever that goal is. Most other job descriptions, you're also going to include any individual employer specific rules that they might have, maybe no smoking, family member, children, things like that on the job. You're also going to have your backup plan. Typically, when it comes to staffing, listed at the end of that job description. So if you have a calling tree, who's the backup, who they call, how they call, those specifics should all be there, in addition to like an emergency plan in case of an emergency, what that staff will do when they're on the job. All of those specifics should be ironed out and documented in that job description, because that's, again, one of those really important forms that you're going to fall back on when it comes to managing and having oversight of that arrangement. That it's important that both the employer and the employees all know exactly what their expectations are, who to go to in case of an emergency, who to call if they can't come in, things like that. And so again, I think that there are examples attached to the self-direction technical guidance as well.
Yeah, and the job description is actually mentioned in the employee agreement, I believe, specifically. So it is part of these agreements that needs to be, there needs to be some kind of document, like Marie said, to really lay out what it is that this person is going to be responsible to do, so that if something's not going well, there really is a kind of a legal agreement, right, that said, you agreed to do X, Y, and Z, and that's not happening. So now something needs to happen, more training or suspension or whatever it is, that employer record has the authority to kind of step in. And then the CMH has an authority to, if things go completely sideways, that they can kind of say, you know, the employer has tried everything else. We're not going to be able to fund this arrangement anymore. Hopefully that's the very, very, very last step, but you know, that because those agreements aren't being met anymore. So it keeps everybody safe and kind of in an agreement that they're going to kind of follow through on whatever specifically was agreed upon, so that if there's any problems, there's literally something in writing that everybody can look to figure out what's supposed to be happening.
Yeah, and those specifics also really help support the arrangement when it comes to things like documenting, right? Like we're always talking about looking for the golden thread. And so when it comes time for those staff and that employer to help make sure that that documentation is meeting those requirements, now you have a tie into the plan through the job description that ties into that self-determination agreement, that then ties into the documentation, so that we have that thread, so that everybody's looking at the same expectations for how services are being implemented to meet those goals.
Yeah. So now when the person gets into interview time, you know, we have the basic, you know, interview questions, where do you want to be in 5 years, and all the basic things that you hear people say. And again, I'm sure there's a plethora of, you know, questions and information on the internet. But really, you want people to be able to interview for some of the soft skills that these people will need to be directly working with an individual. And really, you want to make sure that someone is trustworthy and has the compassion to do this job. There's not a lot of necessarily educational qualifications or needed qualifications, I should say, for this job. So really trying to be able to hone in on, you know, who is this person as an individual, and are they going to be able to be trusted and have the compassion I need in this job. So some questions that I found around those things are, you know, kind of, how would you define a reliable employee? What are their core values? Do you describe yourself as a team player? Tell me a time that you had a positive impact on someone. Give me an example of a time when compassion helped someone stay calm and positive. Maybe asking about ethical dilemmas, or, you know, one time you feel you made a difference in someone else's life. Something as simple as that. So those are kind of the things that will help people kind of understand who this person is a little bit better, and really reaching out and looking for whether or not the person has those skills. So once the person has gone through interviews and they are ready to start the person, they would offer the person whatever the wage is per hour, and then make sure that they're telling them that it's pending that background check. So, until background checks and staff qualifications are made, the person is kind of temporarily offered that position. There are trainings that can be started. The IPS needs to be trained right away, but we want to make sure that background check is done, and people can kind of get going. Before all of that happens, we want to do all of those agreements that we were talking about earlier. So there's 6 of them in here. The self-directed services agreement is kind of the big one. Financial management service agreement is between that FMS and the employer of record. The employment agreement itself is for the employees and the employer. And purchase of service agreement, if you're using a purchase of service agreement, is for that professional staff and the individual. The Medicaid provider agreement is it's kind of the same provider agreement that any Medicaid provider is going to use. And then the agency supported self-directed services agreement. And that's if you're using that, what we used to call an agency with choice model. So this agreement is really describing the responsibilities of the CMH and the ways that they can support the individual in creating and using their self-directed services. It's describing the authority and responsibilities of that individual, how that agreement and the IPS and the individual budget can be changed. So really making sure that everybody understands that process. If anything needs to be different than planned, what's going to happen and how that's going to happen. And then the arrangements with the FMS as written. So this is really laid out for to be customized and make sure that it's really individualized to the person. And again, like as I was saying earlier, if there are any things that the CMH is concerned about, possibly going sideways or not being successful, this is a great place to put in some parameters and limitations. There's a section that specifically talks about limitations. There should always be a expiration date on those limitations where the agreement will be reviewed, and if that limitation can be lifted, it will be. Otherwise it would morph into whatever else it would need to be to kind of keep everybody going in a successful direction. Then the financial management service agreement explains the roles and responsibilities of the FMS. And then the duties of the CMH. There should be somebody at the CMH who's kind of the designated liaison for the one at the FMS and one at the CMH, so that those 2 parties know exactly who to contact if there's any issues. And then really for the FMS to understand what it is exactly that the CMH wants from them. There should be basic duties across the board for all FMSs, but some CMHs, for example, they're okay with doing their own background checks on all these individuals, and other ones want the FMS to do the background checks. So it just depends on in their contract what they've agreed to, what will go in these agreements. And then basically figuring out like how the FMS will approve timesheets, which should only include the information on the timesheet and no clinical documentation, because that is not the FMS's responsibility.
And I think I want to clarify that we're not saying that the FMS should be approving timesheets. The employer should be approving timesheets.
Yes.
It may have not been the exact appropriate word. And the FMS should be processing the approved timesheets.
Yes. It's like approval after the approval, I guess. Apologies for the confusing language. In the employment agreement, you're really talking about the nature of the self-directed services, the employment arrangement or relationship, and the structure of those authorization and payment mechanisms. So basically, that employee is getting a real idea again of those roles and responsibilities. This is where I was saying like that job description comes into play. So I believe there's literally language that says as written in the job description. So that's where you're getting kind of the nature of the employment relationships, et cetera. You're getting a detail of how much the employee will be compensated. So this is where the employer record has determined what the wages and benefits are. And this is going into this agreement so that, again, everybody knows what's going on. And that FMS is going to be able to then pay the right wage to the person. They're outlining rules and regulations for the employee. So again, it talks about, making sure that the person is actually working, providing the actual service that they're providing, and that they're going to follow the rules and regs of Medicaid. That goes again with ORR, et cetera. So again, just making sure that they're meeting all of those requirements that we need to meet in as a Medicaid provider. And then our purchase of service agreement, again, if the person is contracting with a professional who is not impaneled with that CMH, this does the same thing, describes the duties for that service provider, their compensation. In this case, that provider's compensation is going to be the Medicaid rate at that CMH. There's no wage negotiation for this purchase of service agreement. It's just whatever that Medicaid rate is. And then again, that person needs to be able to understand, the provider needs to understand the rules and regs for Medicaid. And they're going to also become a Medicaid provider and be able to sign that agreement as well. And not only accept that rate, but they should be free of any kind of non-compete clause if they work for another agency and available to work whatever hours that the employer, well, in this case, I don't know, what do we call them, a contracted entity, that this person becomes, that they will be available to do that job.
And I want to point out too that it's important to understand who is a party to which agreement, right? So both the employment agreement and the purchase of service agreement, the only people that are parties to those are the provider and the employer when it comes to the arrangement. The community mental health, the FMS, are not parties to those agreements, so they don't have enforcement power over those. Whereas where we talk about the Medicaid provider agreement, that is different. And this is the only agreement outside of the self-determination agreement that the community mental health is a party to and has the ability to enforce. So this is the agreement between the community mental health and the provider, whether that's a direct employer or employee or a purchase of service provider. And this is the document that, I guess for lack of a better phrase, really has the teeth when it comes to compliance and oversight of the employees. So we'll often get questions, and we'll talk more about this in the next webinar, but we get questions related to, well, can we fire that person, or can we tell them that they can't hire that person anymore? And the answer in a black and white sense is no, but you do have this Medicaid provider agreement to fall back on that outlines the expectations for that person's staff provider to be able to be paid with Medicaid dollars through the budget. And so while you're not able to tell someone that they can't work for someone, you do have a lot of authority when it comes to this agreement. So it's imperative that both the employer and the employee / purchase of service provider understands the language in this agreement and what they're agreeing to. Sorry,
absolutely. And then last, the agency supported self-direction agreement. This is defining the kind of roles and responsibilities for that agency. Really you're making sure that the person they have control over the people that are going to get hired into their home, and like kind of the parameters on how much control. So like I had said earlier, that individual is able to hire and fire people in and out of their house, but obviously they're going to keep working for that agency. and be able to go hopefully work for somebody else if they are dismissed from that person's home. But what other kind of, roles, like how much supervision is the agency providing versus the individual? Because it can be a wide range of duties and responsibilities that the person can have. This is an opportunity for someone who's interested in self-directing, but maybe doesn't want to take on a lot of the extra. They don't like scheduling. They don't want to be responsible for timesheets. They don't want to worry about payroll or anything like that. Where that agency can take on that role and the person can kind of just manage when the person is, working that shift. So, really, like we have been saying, this is really individualized to whatever that agency and that person agree to as far as what the roles and responsibilities for that agency will be. We have a question.
Yeah, it looks like it. Sorry.
Sorry, there was a question about, can an adult hire their parents to be their CLS provider?
Yes. I don't know if I need to say more, but yes, as an adult, you are able to hire your parents. As a child, no, not at the moment.
A parent who is not a guardian or responsible relative.
Yeah, which would only be a guardian at that point.
Right. So, we did have another question. And again, I think this is more of a nuanced language piece about for the purchase of service, having the provider accept a fee set by Medicaid, but there is no fee set by Medicaid. That the fee is set by the community mental health and county by county. And can we clarify?
Yes, I'm sorry if the rate would be set by the CMH.
Yeah.
So I apologize if it sounded like it was saying the fee is set by Medicaid. Oh, I was saying that they have to accept the Medicaid rate. I see.
Yeah.
Which is set by the CMH. So yes, thank you for that clarification. So hopefully nobody else was confused by that.
Hopefully that cleared that up. If not, feel free to ask again.
Yes. Okay. So in order for the workers to be qualified to provide Medicaid services, they need to be able to prevent communicable diseases, be able to perform emergency procedures, have a knowledge of basic first aid, be trained in the person's IPOS, be able to be in good standing of the law, be over 18, et cetera, et cetera. So the state mandated qualifications for these workers are really around the training is really about bloodborne pathogens, which is the being able to prevent communicable diseases, having emergency preparedness training, which is being able to deal with emergencies, having a basic first aid class, which is the knowledge of first aid, and then recipient rights just comes in because we need recipient rights for these arrangements. And then all providers need to be trained in the plan of service. So if you have on many of the waivers, typically if you have any beneficiary specific emergency procedures, like someone has seizures or I don't know, a feeding tube or something, and something goes awry, that beneficiary specific training would be inside that IPOS training. So that will also count if there's a need for those kind of trainings as well. So those are the basic trainings that the person needs to be qualified to perform their service. So if a CMH is asking for training above and beyond, They cannot mandate that training. There's specific trainings that some people must have, but it doesn't mean that the person's not qualified to be a Medicaid provider. So for example, if someone can not take their own medications and that person will be passing meds, they would need to have a medication training. So that would technically be a mandatory training, but it's not what's going to make them qualified as a Medicaid provider. So when you get into wanting to pull Medicaid agreements, provider agreements, and things like that, because the person's no longer qualified, medication training would not be one of those. You would just suspend the person's ability to, I don't know if it was like a lapsed medication training, then you would suspend that person from being able to pass meds, not suspend them from working because they haven't, had their recipient rights training, for example. So that's kind of the nuance and the difference. And so any other training should be based on what that employer record would like above and beyond this training, not what the CMH is trying to get them to take.
And then I would circle back to that job description that if the employer of record has chosen training in addition to these basic Medicaid requirements, those should be listed out in the job description as requirements of their job in addition to these requirements. And that especially helps when we look at making sure that providers are being paid for required training.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that, and they should be paid for this training. So that's something that should have been laid out in the budget, as how much they'll get paid for training and how much training, how much time that training should take up. So. All right, so in order to make all this work right, the employer record needs to have good communication with all the parties. We've said, I think, a couple of times now that they're the ones coming up with whatever the specific wage is. So there should be a point in time where the FMS is being able to contact the employer record and say, your wage range is from, minimum wage, which is not technically minimum wage with our pass through, but a minimum wage to an X amount based on whatever the budget is. So there's a wage calculator we went through in the budget presentation. So if you can use that to be able to figure out how much a person can or should pay somebody. So they should be able to have that specific information, that their final decision, give that to the FMS so that the FMS can withdraw the correct amount of money and pay out payroll correctly. The FMS is going to be able to help with that start date to the employee once the background check is passed, to be able to say, go ahead and let this person start as of this day. The employer of record should be able to communicate when the employee is training. So you typically on the timesheet, there's just some way to indicate like this part of their shift is going to be training, so that if there's a different training rate, that the FMS will know to pay out that training rate instead of the full wage. And then, throughout the employee's time working with this person, they need to let that individual know whatever their specific preferences and needs are, so that employee can really customize, how they're delivering services to that individual. So again, this is an alternative service delivery where that person's really minute needs that you think about, like whether or not you want to get up in the morning and roll right out of bed, and I don't know whether you get dressed first or you take a shower or you have a cup of coffee before you do anything else in your pajamas or whatever you do. Everybody has like a different routine, and so these people are able to really have their employees match whatever it is that they specifically want, instead of maybe in an agency or a group home where there's a specific schedule and we got to get everybody out the door by 8:30 or whatever, and so you're just kind of having everybody else fit into their model instead of being able to personally tailor whatever it is that that employer wants. So
And Laura,
go ahead.
sorry, we did have a question about the recipient rights training.
Mhm.
Is the 4-hour in-person recipient rights training required, or are there other options available?
There is not a requirement of time for recipient rights. I'm not sure if in this specific case we're talking about you know, the typical like professional level recipient rights. I would hope that if there's a really intense training like that, that it could be broken into smaller pieces for the individual. But it sounds like maybe whatever the CMH is has decided to, I don't know, make something all inclusive. So I would just the point is that the training meets the needs to train the individual on the basics they need to be able to serve this individual in the role that they're in. So for example, part of recipient rights that there's I don't know, I'll call it a module, I guess, for lack of better words, but there's part that talks about like letting people have freedom to read and watch what they want on TV, for example, and being able to support them to do those things on their own. Well, it's a little bit different when you're I'm not saying it's not important, but that's your boss. So it's a different scenario, right? To tell your boss, like, oh, you can't read that magazine or you can't watch that TV because it's, I don't approve or whatever. So it's just something to think about from the CMH perspective of what exactly you're training, making the mandatory training for these arrangements. As far as staff qualifications from a compliance issue, it just needs to have enough evidence that the person was actually trained and that they understand the ins and outs of recipient rights. So that could be an online module. I guess it could be a 4-hour training, but that's not the requirement. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. So now that the person's hopefully hired some people and they're getting their arrangement up and running, they need to have a schedule in the future. Staff will be probably mandated to use EVV. So that's electronic visit verification, which is mandated by the federal government. In Michigan, it's going to start sometime next year. So that is going to be done through a mobile application, if possible, if there's cell service, if there's internet somewhere. If not, there will be a way to use a phone, and that will kind of take place of paper time sheets. So in the future, you could look forward to that. So there is a way on HHAX, which is HHA Exchange. They have an app called Care Connect, and there is a way for people in self-directed arrangements, the employer of records can actually make a schedule on this app, and then that builds parameters in for their employees to only be able to clock in and clock out at the times that they're scheduled. Obviously, if there's some kind of emergency or people need to swap shifts, or for some reason that person needs to work outside of that schedule, that can still be done. But it's a way that the employer of record can better schedule their employees if they choose to use that function. So that's something to look forward to. Obviously, a paper schedule using a calendar, whatever works best for that individual, is a fine way to do that schedule. And it really helps for the employer record to understand the farther ahead you can schedule people, the better it'll be for them and their employees, because especially if there are frequent schedule changes, if people kind of have a heads up long before whatever is going to happen, that they're going to be scheduled on a certain day, they're going to be able to have more time to pivot if they need to change something. So it's nice to have those schedules made as far in advance as the employer record is comfortable. And then everybody kind of knows what's going on. And if people need to, something comes up and they need to swap shifts or whatever, they'll have the ability to do that. Whereas if you only have scheduling done for this week and somebody knows that they have a conflict from their typical schedule like 2 weeks from now, but they don't know what the schedule is, it's going to be harder for them to make changes or plan for that. So just something that you can help support them to do. And then get into the general roles and responsibilities of everybody. In this fun circle graphic, you can see that the employer record is kind of at the center of everything, and then they're supported by their employees, who, and both of them are supported by the FMS, and all of them are supported by the CMH. So really, in these situations, the CMH is there to really provide that support and oversight. And I mean support as in, we are trying to help you make this as successful as possible, and trying to make things work, and making sure that as issues arise, they're getting dealt with in an efficient amount of time so that things don't get out of control. The FMS is working as that fiscal employer agent again, so they're working with the individual to keep their budget in check, making sure that things are on the up and up and that Medicaid guidelines are being followed. The employee is providing quality services, ensuring health and safety, making sure that their documentation meets Medicaid guidelines. They're following the training and guidance of their employer, and making sure that everything seems to be going well from their standpoint. And then the employer record is really kind of in control, managing and running their arrangement, really, again, customized to their wants and needs as to how those services should be delivered. So everybody needs to work together to make this work well, and good communication and support for each other is what is key. And that kind of leads into our last webinar. So this will be to be continued. In the meantime,
And I do want to throw a plug in that we do have a great table at the end of the guidance that really walks through a lot of common scenarios that we see in these arrangements, that lays out whose role is and responsibility is what within each of those scenarios. I would always encourage folks to use that, as it is currently our best practice guide for implementing and monitoring and overseeing these.
Heather and Marie, can you tell people how they'll find these recordings?
Heather?
Yes, so these will be posted on our website. We did have a little bit of a technical issue getting some of those PDFs out. So I am working on that. So we should be able to get those out by the end of this week.
But there is a link, correct, on our website to the YouTube channel.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I think
you
it
can
might
also
be,
find, oh, pardon, go ahead.
sorry, I think it's specific to like each title, but once you click on one, it'll take you there.
Yeah, so that YouTube channel does have past webinar recordings for the monthly person-centered planning webinar, along with past recordings from our annual self-determination conference as well.
Does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? Well, if not, I hope to see you all at our last webinar on Thursday, which is about oversight of the arrangements. Really kind of getting into kind of that risk mitigation and making sure that everything is proceeding hopefully as planned. So we look forward to seeing you there. That one will also be recorded and up on the website if you do have a conflict, but please tell your colleagues and friends if they're something that they'd be interested in. We look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, and for those folks who don't have it, we did just see that somebody may not have the webinar. The next webinar is Thursday. The next and last webinar is this Thursday at 3 o'clock. And Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, if you registered for this webinar series, you should have that same link should work for each webinar.
Yes, once you register for one, you are registered for
Yeah.
all of the webinars in this series.
Okay, and I see Lindia popped on.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure someone had asked a question about the recipient rights training and the improving my practices webpage, which I just I think you may be speaking of the new hire training. So it used to be that the ORR new hire training was required to be in person. But since COVID, I believe they're offering that flexibility where you can still be trained in person, or you can have the virtual option as well. I would need to confirm that though with our ORR department. I don't know about the 4 hours. It was always my understanding that those trainings were generally about 2 hours. So I don't think that there's a 4-hour requirement. That the training has to be 4 hours. Perhaps maybe it could be CMH specific, which we find sometimes the ORR trainings do have some flexibility in making some specific components to their trainings. I think your best bet is really to go on to the webpage of that CMHSP. In there, all of them have a designated ORR section where you can find that out. Keep in mind though, once you get that new hire training, you'll receive a certificate. And if you keep that certificate updated, meaning you do that online renewal every year, you should be able to present that certificate to another county and they should be able to accept it because many of our CMHSPs have reciprocation between their ORR offices. So hopefully that answers your question. I have not seen the Improving My Practices, their recipient rights webpage, and whether I'm presuming it's an online training for their annual, but I would really have to follow up and look. Your best bet always with ORR, because it is county specific, is to go to the region that you're receiving services or that you are going to work for, just to be sure. They're going to lead you in the right direction. And of course, they have plenty of trainings offered monthly. So that would always be my suggestion, is to go to them. I just wanted to make sure to provide that, that additional information.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for the information, and thank you everyone for attending and for your questions. And we hope to see you back on Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.